Okay, so this week's lectures and readings focus on public leadership and leadership in a crisis. Today we will be discussing how we believe organizations can prepare leaders for all level of response to a crisis. And we will be taking into consideration the BP oil spill and the failures of communication in that crisis. Who would like to start us off?
I can say that I've actually been a part of a crisis management team here at my job. It was a couple of years ago, and while we were going through the process, I'll admit that I didn't understand the importance of it. And it wasn't until I read this chapter that I realized that it is really important, regardless of what type of organization you work in, to have like a crisis management plan in place, because it's probably better to be prepared for something that never occurs than it is to not be prepared at all. And I mean, there were probably 20 people from all different parts of the organization, and we sat in a room and just brainstormed everything that could potentially happen and then what we would do if each of those scenarios happened. And so I do think that having that pre-crisis plan in place is really the foundation for everything that follows, and that without that, a company would be completely lost if a crisis actually did hit.
Yeah, I agree with you. This summer, I worked at a swimming pool, and we had to go through like trainings, like if something would happen, like whatever it would be. Like I live in Iceland, and there, like nothing ever happens. Like the police doesn't even carry a gun. So, but like we had to be like prepared for everything. So like there's like emergency button. So like if something happens, like we have to press the button. And, like it's like a process that we have to go through, and we're tested on it to see if we actually know what to do if like, something would ever happen. So I agree that everyone should be like prepared.
I think it's important that you guys all had like knowledge if something did happen, because I think that's like the stage one of a crisis. That's like pre-crisis, and I think that Lana, at your job, like you guys didn't really have like a plan really, because nothing bad really ever happened, right?
Yeah.
So you guys were pretty. It says like the longer the period between crises, the more confident leaders become. And then whenever you do get overconfident, that's when disasters are more likely to happen. So I think it's like really good that Angie, your summer job had like those protocols. So in case anything did happen, you guys were all prepared and not like freaking out like if something were to happen, you know?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because I actually have it from like the other side. I used to work at Oregano's, and I'm not sure if you guys remember last summer there was a car that went through one. And so that's the type of crisis that like as a restaurant, like you wouldn't really be prepared for. I wasn't working at the time, but my best friend was. And it's the type of crisis you wouldn't even imagine in that type of situation, because not only do you have a lawsuit on your hands, you have to start discussing questions like, or what caused the person to drive through the building? We sell alcohol here. How do we handle that? How do we handle there was injuries from people who were inside the building, injuries of people outside the building. There was property damage. There was some pretty graphic things that happened where people needed actual like counselors to talk to. And that was the kind of scenario that like really nobody was prepared for. And so you have people in leadership positions who kind of become your crisis managers, but they really didn't have any information on how to manage a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it just kind of, to bounce off Lana's point of it's like better to be overly prepared than not prepared at all.
Yeah, and I think having a plan in place is maybe something that BP didn't do when their crisis hit, because they didn't know how to handle them. Like it didn't appear that there was a plan in place that said like, be honest, accept accountability. If you say something, mean it, because they tried to deflect responsibility for the several issues they had on other things. And they also continued to say they were going to pay more attention to safety, and so that these same situations like oil spills or pipelines bursting wouldn't occur again in the future. But they didn't, and those issues continued to happen. So I think if they had a plan in place that said, be accountable and take action, then maybe it would have prevented some of their future problems from occurring.
Yeah.
I think that part of what you were saying was how they didn't take responsibility was important because, like in chapter 13, for under the leading during the crisis event section, it talks about just being like honest, like so you're not like lying and saying that you didn't have responsibility when you really did, because it'll just like make the situation worse, and it won't like you just like destroy your credibility basically as a company, and then you have to start again all over.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think especially like in the case of BP, the part in the chapter where it discusses like recognized danger signs, like when there's a huge oil spill like that, and I can't remember the direct thing from the video, but or from when it happened, but you know, just the danger signs can be before the big event, which is the oil spill, or also kind of what Lana was saying is like the lack of transparency. Like that can definitely come back and really ruin a company's credibility, which it has with BP. Like, yes, we still need oil. However, I mean, I see those BP, I don't know if you guys remember, but after the oil spill, they had like BP commercials of like all the great things BP is doing and like how they're helping out the Gulf and how they're supplying people with jobs, but it's like that's always going to be attached to your name. Like Samsung, they're kind of in the midst of a crisis right now with their Galaxy. I think it's their Galaxy Note 7s.
Yeah.
They're kind of in the midst of that crisis, and something you can't control is the way the public's going to take that, like public perception, and even something that's like almost comical is people who have the Samsung Galaxy Note 7s that blow up when you charge them actually aren't turning them in. So that's like a continued crisis of, well, how are we supposed to control the consumer? And you really can't.
I think it's like what you just said, like with the commercials, like there should be a person that if something would happen who's like working with like public relations and stuff like that. Like my friend's dad, he works in like they're making aluminum, and he is like the security guard. So he's basically just making everything so everyone are safe. Like they have to wear gloves. They have to like if something would happen. Like I think it's important to have like a person. So if something happened, make commercials to know that they're not like a bad company or like whatever it is.
Yeah.
I think that the leaders who implement these like protocols and stuff they have to have like a good moral ethic. So I think that like with the BP oil spill, like you just kind of think about like what kind of leader did they have ethically, like if they didn't want to take responsibility, or like with the Samsung phones, like if their leader or you know whoever isn't like ethical, like they wouldn't, like they would have if they were ethical, they would have made sure that the phones would have lasted through anything and wouldn't blow up on people. And the fact that the phones are blowing up, like I haven't heard anything from them so far yet. But like if they were ethical, I think that they would take ownership and responsibility on these events and like try not to like ignore it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I forget the exact term, but I remember reading in the chapter that there is like a word that describes leaders who don't take action because they have like ulterior motives. Like for example, with BP, they said that there wasn't enough money available to like make some of these safety upgrades and whatnot. But in reality, this is like a multi-million or even billion-dollar company. So they were really just trying to save money because it probably impacted their bonuses, and save that money instead of using it for like safety precautions. And there are leaders out there, unfortunately, who do stuff like that. Like they don't want to spend the money, just like with Katrina and the levees. You know, they had already figured out that those levees wouldn't handle a hurricane, but for whatever reason, the government and whoever's responsible didn't want to spend the money to fix them. And then we had this huge disaster.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up Katrina with the levees, because it's almost like a lot of times people in power will be like, oh, well, that's, you know, it could happen, but it probably won't. So, you know, I don't really want to worry about it, especially when you have a company that has such high like management and administration. It's very easy for them to funnel that money back into their own pockets. And it is interesting with BP as well. You know, you're a multi-million-dollar company. Those I mean, when you think about it in the grand scheme of things, it would be such a small budget cut in other areas, such a small salary decrease for all of their like bigwigs to pay for those necessary precautions that like just weren't met.
Exactly. And now I didn't even know that movie that's coming out is related to the BP thing until I read the article today and saw the name of what they called it. So now I want to go see it. I had no clue before.
And it's just interesting too, kind of like the more we're talking about these crises, like it's becoming a reality to me that they're happening every day, like whether it be with Samsung and their phones that blow up, whether it be with Wells Fargo and the fact that like hundreds of thousands of fake accounts were made for people in Wells Fargo. There was recently just something with Monsanto, which makes like the Roundup weed killer. So these really huge global companies that that you almost don't even think of, they're having these crises. And, you know, they're still having a horrible backlash. So it kind of just shows like you can never be too prepared.
Yeah.
If you think about it as well, like we are only hearing about those because they're so big, but think about all the small ones that we cannot hear about because like there must be like millions of them like happening every single day.
Yeah, and I totally agree, and I think it kind of just goes back to the chapter when it says, you know, engage in vigilant decision making. Like you just need to be aware of the status of your company, and really, I think I know this is a communication class, but focusing on communication, like between people, between departments, know what's going on with your competitors. Like, I mean, if I'm VP and I see that Exxon just put in like $70 million in fixing this, you have to ask yourself, well, are we fixing it? Like, what are we doing to make sure that we're prepared?
Yeah.
Good point.
I guess it's good I'm a business major. But I think it's also interesting, kind of just a wrap up. We have about 2 minutes left. Is just kind of like the promote healing that it talks about in the chapter. That it's not just like preparing for a crisis, but also reacting to it after the fact.
I think it's hard. Well, it's going to be harder for like, say, Samsung, for example, for them to like get back to where they were on a business standpoint from this crisis that happened with them. And I think that like the way BP handled it, they tried to, you know, exemplify like all the good things that they're doing. And I think that's helpful, but it's not really going to make up for what they did in the past. So I'm just kind of like interested to see like what they're going to do, like if they're going to come out with something even better or if anyone's even going to buy their products anymore. Like, I just wonder like how that's going to like turn out and like what that's going to do for the iPhone too.
Yeah. And I think it's really important too, kind of what you discussed is, you know, you can point out your positives as often as you like, but people just want other people to take accountability.
Yeah, I think it's important that the spokespeople are honest, because if they are in the beginning, then people may be more forgiving. But, you know, when they lie, like, I don't think that people would be forgiving for them.
Exactly.
Cool. So I think we're at about 15 minutes. Been a pleasure.